You see, they didn't reimagine Silent Hill and use the start of it as a story of a basis to go on a new direction and completely rebuild. No, they just made a completely different game altogether.
Yes,
If
but
they really had tried to reimagine Silent Hill as per the meaning of the word, it would have to follow the plot as they understand it, and
you
so it would
see,
have to have something to do with Alessa's revenge or whatever they think it is. And
actually,
it's not even close to that.
hold on a sec,
To put
guys.
all that more simply, the guys at Climax still don't know what Silent Hill's about, so instead of trying to make another Silent Hill game and failing again, they made their own completely new game, slapped the Silent Hill title onto it,
Whoa, whoa,
and called
whoa.
it a reimagining. They've taken that word and latched onto it, and now they're clinging to it for dear life because that they know it's the only way they can get away with what they've done.
The real Silent Hill experience videos by Twin Perfect have some big problems. That clip from their review of Silent Hill Shattered Memories is one of them. I agree with some of their criticisms of the game, but most of their rant about why the game was a reimagining and the intentions of the game's creators is just wrong. Objectively wrong. I say that because we now know why Shattered Memories was made the way it was. In 2014, a pamphlet was leaked that contained Climax Studios' original pitch for the game. It's full of professional artwork, detailed descriptions and examples of game mechanics, and glimpses into the story that Shattered Memories was supposed to be before it became Shattered Memories. The game wasn't a reimagining because Tom Hewlett, Sam Barlow, and the other developers didn't understand the series and thought that making something in continuity would be too hard, as the Twin Perfect crew suggests. The Climax Studio devs actually planned to make an original, self-contained story that would be in continuity with the rest of the series, like Silent Hill 2 and 4. Turning the game into an alternate version of Silent Hill 1 was a decision that was pushed onto the studio by Konami, who wanted to capitalize on the 10th anniversary of the original game. Forcing the project into the mold of Silent Hill 1 caused a lot of problems. Besides making it necessary to rework all of Studio Climax's plot and character designs, their game mechanic and environment concepts had been tied into their original story ideas. So Silent Hill Shattered Memories ended up becoming a compromise, adopting characters and some plot elements from Silent Hill 1 while trying to preserve some of the game mechanics and environments that were supposed to be in their original concept. Hence the reimagining. Like most compromises, it left a lot of people unhappy. Many content creators have dived deep into Kojima's Silent Hills, discussing every scrap of information on that canceled game. This Halloween, I want to look at a lesser-sung Silent Hill game that never was. Climax Studios' original vision, Silent Hill Cold Heart.
In your mind's eye lives a memory hard to find, blinded by sorrow, and her cold voice sings a melody, hear her sing, ere frozen rain falls down.
Jessica Chambers is an athletic college student whose emotional vulnerability is spilling to the surface. Her posture is defensive, her full lips are tinged blue from the cold, and her sad eyes are glossy and strained. Perhaps she has been crying recently? There's a coolness, too, an icy resolve beneath the surface. Rewind to a week ago, Jessica has become dependent on her psychiatrist. She is becoming removed and emotionally distant, plagued by awful nightmares. Every night she wakes terrified, her body weighed down by a great sadness. A sense of unease and despair is slowly eating away at Jessica from somewhere deep inside. Deciding she needs a break, Jessica skips town, planning to drive across state to visit her parents and clear her head. When freak weather whips up from nowhere, she finds herself caught in a ferocious snowstorm. Seeking shelter, she tails a rescue ambulance through the blizzard, following it when it turns off the interstate. She finds herself in a faded resort town. A snow-covered sign announces it as Silent Hill. These are the opening paragraphs from Silent Hill Cold Heart's introduction. Obviously, we can see that the game would feature a new protagonist, Jessica Chambers. She would have been the second female protagonist in the series. Like Harry in Shattered Memories, she would have had a therapist, but instead of a reimagined Dr. Kaufman from the first game, Jessica's shrink would have been a new character, Dr. Fairchild. There aren't too many details about him in the pitch pamphlet, but based on write-ups of a pair of therapy sessions, he seems a bit more professional than Dr. Kaufman, who often came across as inappropriate and sometimes volatile in Shattered Memories. Maybe the not-so-good Doctor's sleaziness in other games influenced his personality here. Another difference is how Jessica ends up in Silent Hill. Instead of crashing her car, she follows an ambulance to escape the snowstorm, an interesting little nod to the sirens that played in other games. From there, the pitch document says she's stranded, presumably from the snow becoming too heavy to get back on the highway. I made a video earlier about characters needing a driving motivation that keeps them going in Silent Hill, and in Cold Heart, it seems like that motivation, at least early in the game, would have been not freezing to death. Simple, but effective. That brings us to one of the more intriguing game mechanics that would have been central to Cold Heart's gameplay: body heat. Besides standard health from other Silent Hill games, Cold Heart would have had body heat status. Some areas would drain your body heat, and if it dropped too low, game over. Instead of using healing items, body heat would be recovered, or at least draining could be stopped, by taking shelter in warmer areas. Players could also find clothing in-game that would provide more resistance to the cold, causing body heat to drain more slowly. While a few alternate outfits did make it into Shattered Memories, they're purely for cosmetic and story purposes, showing what ending path the player is on. Functionally, there's no difference between them. In Shattered Memories, the cold weather also has no in-game effect. The only way players can get a game over is if they get grappled by the game's one enemy type, the raw shocks, and fail to shake them off. Which brings me to the next major difference. Unlike Shattered Memories, Silent Hill Cold Heart was supposed to have a combat system. The pitch pamphlet describes using motion controls for desperate, realistic melee and ripping weapons from the environment, a phrasing that makes me think of Silent Hill 2's cutscene where James gets his first weapon. Weapons would be breakable, like in Silent Hill Origins, and players could also use items in the environment to slow down enemies and block doors, which is a mechanic that made it into Shattered Memories in a very simplified way. The pamphlet also refers to finishing moves, grapples, and dodges. Not only was there going to be combat, but if all of these features had been implemented, it would probably have been the most complex combat system in a Silent Hill game. Whether that would be a good or bad thing is debatable. It would depend a lot on how it was executed. It's certainly a far cry from Shattered Memories' lack of a combat system and glorified game of zombie tag. There's no mention of firearm combat in the pamphlet, so it's possible that combat was going to be entirely melee-oriented. The traditional health drinks of the series would be replaced with various packaged food and drinks, which would restore different amounts of health. There's also a reference to something called stamina in the pamphlet, which food and drinks would also recover, although what exactly this would be and how it would work isn't explained. The sum of all this would be a game that really put the survival into survival horror, focusing far more heavily on resource and status management than any Silent Hill game had before. It's an interesting idea, and one that I think could make for a very interesting game, if implemented well. The final major game mechanic described in the pitch pamphlet is psychological profiling, which sounds pretty much the same as how it works in Shattered Memories, although based on some other things in the pamphlet, it does sound like they wanted the system to be significantly more in-depth. As it ended up, the psychological profiling worked almost exactly the same way as the multiple endings in Silent Hill 2, just with these added therapy session segments and a couple of cosmetic differences. The last interesting part of the pamphlet is a sort of semi-narrative style write-up of what it would be like to play through a certain segment of the game called The Lake. Now there is a lake section in Shattered Memories, but it plays out very differently. For starters, it's near the end of the game, whereas this version would have been near the beginning. The section would begin with players finding a written message saying that someone went to the lake, the kind of unobtrusive breadcrumb direction to the next area that's fairly common in the Silent Hill series. On the path to the lake, players would encounter a merry-go-round surrounded by what the pamphlet describes as figures, which would look, according to the pamphlet, like either ice sculptures or frozen people. These ice people would then spring to life, cracking at their joints, and attack. Their physical description sounds quite different from the raw shocks, so we can assume that the ice people were an enemy that didn't make it into the game. At this point, players would be overwhelmed by the ice people and driven through an alley to appear by the lake. This would trigger another cutscene where Jessica would fall from the jetty into the lake while trying to avoid the ice people. The ice would then freeze around Jessica with only her head above the surface, and players would then flash back to a therapy session. After playing through the session, the players would be rescued by a mysterious man. The man would disappear, and players with their body heat almost completely gone would be forced to take shelter in a nearby boat sticking out of the ice. In the boat, players would face 2 more enemies before encountering a little girl who would stab Jessica with a knife and run away, triggering another therapy session. So through this write-up, we've been introduced to 2 other original characters from Cold Heart, the mysterious man and the little girl with the knife, although we have very little information about either of them. The man would also be heard in a phone call to Jessica a little later, and the call would change depending on the player's psych profile to make him seem more sinister. According to the write-up, the game would be tracking a lot of different things during gameplay, like how often players chose to fight or run away. The ice people also might have weapons, and whether they would and what sort of weapons they had would be determined by players' therapy sessions and in-game actions, as would the mysterious man's appearance and behavior. The pamphlet also mentions a drawing section during a therapy session and says that while the game couldn't track what players drew, it could track things like how long they spent drawing, how many times they erased, and what colors they used. It all sounds pretty complicated and taxing for the hardware. And therein lies the rub. A lot of Climax Studios' ideas for Cold Heart sound cool, but Konami's interference wouldn't have been the only obstacle. To say they were ambitious is putting it mildly. And a lot of this stuff probably was cut because the humble Wii just couldn't handle it. Although Konami may have exacerbated the problem with their 10-year anniversary plans, since that not only required Climax to completely rework the game's plot, but also put extra pressure on them to meet a 2009 release date, which they only barely made for the North American version of Shattered Memories. As it is, the game we got was extremely stripped down compared to their original vision. It wasn't what Climax Studio wanted. It was, as I said near the beginning, a compromise. But they can still be criticized for what they decided to compromise. Of all the mechanics that were planned for Cold Heart, the psychological profiling is the one that fit the story of Silent Hill 1 the least. So using that in this reimagining required the most drastic changes to the story. What we ended up with is a story that's neither faithful to Silent Hill 1, nor a standalone story that fits into the rest of Silent Hill's lore and continuity. As I said near the beginning, like most compromises, it left a lot of people unhappy. The game has its fans, and even Twin Perfect praised some aspects of it, but it's only a Silent Hill game in the loosest sense. That soundtrack, though.
Still you ask me how I feel. I feel lost. That's how I feel. I know. There's something I've forgotten like a time.
Personally, I would love to see Silent Hill Cold Heart turned into a full-fledged game, but I know that's very unlikely to ever happen. I mean, crazy things have happened, but this is Konami we're talking about. And since circumstances made staying true to the game's original concept impossible, I'd have preferred if Studio Climax had simply focused on turning the project into a proper remake of Silent Hill 1, which they could have incorporated some of their survival mechanic ideas into, but of course that didn't happen either. As it is, Cold Heart joined the great graveyard of game projects that were never really realized. Gone, but maybe with this video, a little less forgotten. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications. Comment if you have any of your own thoughts about Cold Heart or Shattered Memories. Thank you for watching, have a great day, and a happy Halloween.